Right. Well, it is 2 after the hour. We've got a good group of folks that are here. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. You are here for staying nonpartisan for 501c3 organizations operating lawfully in a political environment. I'm Gwen Stembridge. I am the Director of Education and Partnerships at Nonprofit Vote. And I'm really excited today. This is one of our traditional standby webinars that you can rely on us to offer. It is all about staying nonpartisan. This is a part of the bread and butter of our work. So I wanted to give you a couple of housekeeping pieces here. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a little black bar that has a couple of different icons on it. One of those is the chat. It looks like this. That's a great space for introductions, for comments, for sharing links and resources with one another. We love that there is a community of nonprofits that are doing this voter engagement work, and we want you all to be connected with one another in addition to connected to us and our resources. So please do. We love to see that chat happening there, but save that space for that. If you have questions, those should go in this little Q&A box here, a little box with a question mark in it. If you'll put your questions there, it will make it a lot easier for us to actually respond to them. There will be a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please add your questions there, and then we'll be able to ask them toward the end. And then if you are excited about what you're hearing from our speaker, or you want to just give them any kind of feedback, you can use this react button here, which we love. That's always encouraging to see some hearts or some celebrations or anything like that. Please do use those. And as a reminder, this is always a question we get, but the webinar will be recorded, and a recording as well as a copy of the slides will be sent out to everyone who registered, not just everyone who attended, but everyone who registered for the webinar. And this will also be shared on our YouTube page later. So lots of ways to get this information. We want to be sure that it's as accessible as possible. So next is our agenda. This is what our time over the next hour or so looks like. You have officially been welcomed. Welcome. We're glad that you're here. We're reviewing the agenda now. We'll tell you a little bit about who Nonprofit Vote is, and then introduce our speaker. Then she will present on staying nonpartisan in these times as a 501c3 organization. And then we'll have some time at the end for audience Q&A. So please put those questions in the Q&A box. And then I come to this work from a community organizing lens and cannot leave you all without a call to action. So we'll close out with a call to action and some next steps and resources. So to just give you a sense of who Nonprofit Vote is, in case you're not familiar, this is only our second webinar of 2026. And so some of you all may be newer to us. Some of you have been coming to these webinars for years, and we love it. We're so glad to see you again and again. So Nonprofit Vote is really all about equipping you all as nonprofit leaders, as nonprofit volunteers, with the tools that you need to do nonpartisan voter engagement in whatever way that looks. And that is part of a goal and a vision of creating a more inclusive democracy. We know that the nonprofits that you all represent and where you are working with community members that are often underrepresented in a lot of areas of civic life. And so if we can ensure that you have the tools that you need to register and engage and get folks out to vote, then we will have a more inclusive and more representative democracy. If you want to learn more about our work, we have a biennial report that just came out. So do take a look at that when you have a moment. And then without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker here, Stephanie Robbins, who's a partner at Harman Curran, Spielberg and Eisenberg law firm. And this is her second year presenting this webinar for us. And we're so grateful. Often we get these requests and these questions that I am not an attorney and I am not able to answer. And so we love to bring in our friends who are attorneys, who are able to speak to these issues. She'll give you her disclaimer about how she is an attorney, she is not your attorney, and all of that. But I'll just say we're so excited to have Stephanie here. She comes to this work with a wealth of experience, not just at this firm, but also previously at the IRS. And so working with nonprofits, she's got this wealth of information, and we're so thrilled that she's with us today. So I will pass it on to you, Stephanie. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Gwen. I am happy to be here again. Standard disclaimers. This presentation is given for informational purposes only. It's not provided in the course of an attorney-client privilege. It's not intended as a solicitation. It is not legal advice, and it is not a substitute for legal advice from a qualified attorney. I'm going to do two things today, and skipped, which are kind of contradictory. I am going to go through a lot of information and I'm trying to not speak too fast. So we'll see how good I do. And we're going to try to reserve about 15 minutes at the end for questions, because there's always a lot of questions about these topics. So just briefly, we'll start with an overview of 501c3, and then we're going to discuss the various types of permissible nonpartisan political activity. Here we go. So you all have worked for 501c3s, are familiar with 501c3s. You understand that they have to operate for particular purposes, like religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, et cetera, et cetera. What we're going to focus on today is the fact that 501c3 organizations cannot participate or intervene directly or indirectly in any political campaign intervention on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. That's a long definition. We'll get into it a little bit more here. So there are some other bullets on the slide that are just for your information and for reminders of things that 501c3s can and cannot do. What is important to remember is that a Section 501c3 organization is prohibited from engaging in partisan political activity. There are nonpartisan political activities that a 501c3 organization can engage in, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to kind of skip over the slide, but I've provided a couple of definitions to illustrate that the prohibited activities under the code are much different than the broader meaning of the word political or politics. So it's not that 501c3s can't engage in any political activity. It's just this one specific type. Okay, so again, nonpartisan good, partisan bad. The types of nonpartisan activities that 501c3s can engage in are issue advocacy, voter education, voter registration to get out the vote, and certain candidate engagements. The things that 501c3s cannot do are endorse candidates for public office, donate money to political campaigns, or conduct any partisan election-related activities. All right. So the IRS, when it determines whether or not an organization has engaged in political activity, and we're talking just generally here outside of the categories I just discussed, the IRS is going to look at fact and circumstances. Some of the things that they're going to look at is whether you're referencing a candidate or elections, whether there's something else that's happening that's influencing why you're having an event, whether you're addressing a broad range of issues, your history on work on a particular issue. Facts that can be bad, although they won't necessarily turn an activity automatically into campaign activity, would be referencing a candidate, timing certain communications like close to the election, certain types of politically motivated targeting, and like talking about wedge issues could be problematic, or comparing the organization's preferred position with the position of candidates. The facts and circumstances test is not an exact science. It is when we do this analysis, we come up with kind of a spectrum. There's something that actually as absolutely is campaign intervention. Say you want to endorse a candidate, no question there, that's political campaign intervention. But then when you go towards the other side, where you're looking at nonpartisan issue advocacy, educational type events, you can have an event that falls anywhere on the spectrum that I've provided on this slide. And different facts can influence where you fall on the spectrum. So it's very, very fact specific is the point I'm trying to make, which can be very frustrating when you're trying to come up with an activity or determine if a communication is permissible. I will say there could be some change in this area in the future. There is a case that goes by the name of Freedom Path, where a court has ruled that a facts and circumstances test, specifically in this political arena, is probably unconstitutionally vague, but we don't have any like precedential rulings on that yet. So we're kind of waiting to see where this goes and how it may affect how we look at these issues in the future. So issue advocacy is one of the first areas I want to talk about. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I spoke a lot last year on issue advocacy much more broadly. So I would refer you back to that recording, which I believe is on Nonprofit Votes YouTube channel. But generally, issue advocacy, what we're looking for is that it's conveying information and educating. When the IRS is looking to see if an organization is engaged in issue advocacy versus educational activity, one of the things they're going to look at is that the method that the organization uses to present its views. So there are, for issue advocacy to be permissible, what we're looking for is, viewpoints and positions that are supported by facts. Those facts are accurately conveyed and objectively evaluated, and they're also aimed at developing the public understanding. Bad facts can be like unsupported views, distorted views, inflammatory language. Again, it's all part of a larger facts and circumstances analysis, but we want it to be more on the well-weighted and considered side. So when you're engaging in issue advocacy, say you're against the new SAVE Act, what we're going to be looking at is, do your communications about that act refer to a candidate or voting in an upcoming election? Are you targeting that communication towards a candidate who is for the SAVE Act? Are you comparing your organization's position to that candidate's position? Are you expressing approval or disapproval of a candidate or their position? And then, we're also looking for divisive issues. So, traditionally abortion has been a divisive issue in elections, and that tends to be an area where we have to take a lot more care with organizations that are doing communications in that area. And we're also going to be looking at timing. Good factors for timing tend to be, it's a topic that the organization talks about year round. It's part of the issues that the organization has always advocated for or against. Again, facts and circumstances. All right. So now into the more specific types of nonpartisan voter engagement, where I'd like to spend the most of our time. So one type of nonpartisan political activity are voter guides. A voter guide, what that does is it provides a side-by-side comparison of candidates on key issues. Organizations can research and create these guides on their own without the input of any candidates, or they can kind of compile these voter guides by sending out surveys to candidates to answer. The key for a voter guide to be nonpartisan is that all candidates have to be included. There should be a broad range of issues, not just the range of issues that your particular organization is concerned with. There should be no rating or comparing of candidates, and you shouldn't suggest which position your organization favors on any of the issue. It really should be just a very plain vanilla, this is this person's position, this is this person's position. When it comes to surveys that are sent to candidates, yes, the surveys have to be sent to all candidates, but not all candidates are going to respond, and that's fine. Sometimes organizations use these surveys to create the voter guides. Sometimes they just publish the full voter guides on their, or not voter guides, the full surveys on their website. When you do that, we recommend that you put all the candidates with a link, PDF, whatever, to what they filled out. And then for candidates that didn't fill anything out, you just state, candidate did not return the survey. Something very Again, that statement shouldn't indicate whether that's a positive or a negative. Legislative scorecards are another nonpartisan political activity. And what these are records of how candidates and non-candidates voted on issues before the legislature. For a legislative scorecard to be nonpartisan, it's going to include all the legislators, not just candidates. It's not going to rate or score legislators based on their individual votes, and it's going to focus on broad issues of interest to the public. So and timing is another factor. Like typically legislative scorecards are kind of timed to the end of a legislative session. So it's kind of a natural result of the legislative year. That may depend though, sometimes there's always, exceptions. I did want to put up here, there are lots of organizations that do legislative scorecards. And if your organization has a related 501c4, you have a little bit more flexibility with the types of information you could share on those scorecards and your ability to focus, on particular candidates' positions, et cetera. Not the point of this particular webinar, but I think important to note that there's some flexibility if you have related organizations. Voter registration and get out the vote are two very important nonpartisan political activities, particularly this year. Voter registration is literally helping people get onto the voting polls. It's giving them voter registration forms. It's directing them to voter registration sites, et cetera. Get out the vote is getting the people to the polls, like, providing a neighborhood with a bus that takes them to the poll or anything along that line. The key for voter registration and get out the vote to being nonpartisan is that you have to use nonpartisan criteria to select a location and audience. So you're not just targeting Democratic voters in the particular precinct. You're going to say a population that has a harder time getting transportation to the polls, or to a group that traditionally doesn't vote as much. Those types of things are what you're going to be looking at. So, and sometimes you could be a little bit more targeted. For example, like I have an example in my notes here of like a healthcare group that registers people in a district because it's represented by an unchallenged senator who chairs the committee overseeing the state's Medicaid programs. A very specific example, but that could be okay depending on what the other facts and circumstances are. So if you're trying to engage in like a more targeted voter registration or get out the vote activity, I highly recommend talking to counsel and considering how the program is going to be done and, gathering all of the facts and circumstances so that there's a full picture and that there won't be any problem if the IRS were ever to come and actually examine your organization. Candidate debates and forums. So any sort of candidate appearance is an area where I get a lot of questions from my clients. There's a lot of guidance around candidate debates and forums. So we know that if you're going to do these debates or these forums, the questions have to be prepared and presented by an independent, nonpartisan panel. The topics discussed have to cover a broad range of issues. Candidates must be given equal opportunity to present their views on each issue. You may have recently seen the reports this week about James Tallarico's Colbert Show interview and the uproar about the Federal Communications Commission's equal airtime rule. It's a very similar rule in this IRS space about equal airtime. Not the same rule, but similar. You're also gonna like the nonpartisan panel that's presenting the questions is not going to be able to react to those questions. They cannot indicate whether or not they disagree or agree with his positions, agendas, platforms. And again, the moderator does not comment or otherwise express approval or disapproval of candidates. Candidate appearances is also another area I get a lot of questions. So to be clear, this slide refers to candidate appearances as speakers. I should probably have added additional language there. So your organization can invite candidates in their capacity as candidates to speak, but a lot like the candidate forum rules, you have to provide an equal opportunity to participate to other candidates for the same position. You won't be able to indicate your support or opposition to that candidate, and you have to ensure that there's no political fundraising that occurs at that event. You can also invite candidates in their capacity as individuals. In this case, you're choosing them to speak based on reasons other than they are a candidate for a particular office. For example, you could invite a mayor to come speak on issues that are relevant to the community, even though he or she is a candidate. If that's the case, you have to be clear with the audience that the mayor is not speaking in their capacity as a candidate, and then also be sure that the candidate is informed that they can't talk about the candidacy and that the organization is not going to mention it. And again, we're going to go for that. Like there cannot be any campaign activity at the events. And, we're looking for kind of a nonpartisan atmosphere. When a candidate is invited in their capacity as a non-candidate, you don't have to invite all the candidates. You can just invite them for their specific, non-candidate reason. So candidates can also appear at a Section 501c3 organization's event that are open to the public, not as a speaker, but simply as an uninvited participant. That is not an activity that's going to automatically make the event partisan. You have no control over people who come to a public event, right? You can also invite a candidate to attend an event sponsored by the organization. In that case, if you are going to do that, the organization has to make sure to not publicly recognize the candidate, and the rest of the event should be conducted in a nonpartisan manner. Those events tend to be like the normal kind of educational events that your organization is going to be putting on day to day. A lot of my clients come to me and say, "Hey, Stephanie, we'd like to make a comment about this candidate's statements." And this is an area where it can be really tricky, and it is helpful to have an attorney to walk through the pros and cons of making comments on a candidate statement, particularly because it's just because a candidate's making it, particularly if they're making the statement in their capacity as a candidate, it's automatically going to look like it is a partisan communication, even though maybe it doesn't come out that way under the facts and circumstances analysis. The types of good facts we're looking for if an organization wants to comment on a candidate statement is, the organization is just using the candidate statement as a way to restate the organization's own position. Or, and there's no comment specifically on the candidate's position except for like, so and so also, has stated X. It makes sense to comment on candidate statements when the issue that the candidate is commenting on is central to your organization's mission. So for a reproductive rights organization to comment on a candidate statement on abortion restrictions is pretty central to their mission. But maybe it wouldn't be the same if the reproductive rights organization was commenting on something that having to do with immigration. It depends. It could. Who knows? Again, another area we're going to be looking is like, does the organization regularly comment on candidate statements? And then why are we making this comment now? Are we making the comment because it's close in time to election? Is there something else that came up that triggered this comment? So those are good facts. Bad facts are kind of the opposite side of that coin. If the organization really cannot be comparing the organization's position to the candidate's position in a statement. If an organization doesn't ever comment on a candidate statement, that could be a bad fact as well. Or, the organization's only commenting on wedge issues. Like even if the organization is not directly saying anything about candidates, there can be an appearance of partisanship there. And ballot measures. Ballot measures are not a political activity, believe it or not, for IRS purposes. The IRS considers ballot measure advocacy to be lobbying, because when a legislative question is sent to the public for a vote, the public becomes the legislature. So if you're in an organization that has a 501h election, then the IRS is going to consider any sort of ballot measure advocacy direct lobbying. The trick here is that states consider ballot measure activity to be regulated by state election and campaign finance laws. So it can be very tricky figuring out like permissible activities under state law. This is one of these areas where it's very important to talk with legal counsel, particularly if you're trying to avoid having to register as like a ballot initiative committee or a political committee for state law purposes. But because it's not considered political activity, an organization that engages in ballot measure activity has a lot more flexibility. The organization can advocate for or against ballot measures. You can target communications more freely than you could if you were doing get out the vote or registration or education. And you don't have to present both sides of the issues. So this next slide has a few of nonprofit votes tools and information that are very helpful. They're linked so that you can easily find them when you get a copy of these slides. And now we are going to go to questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. You did run through those plenty quickly, and I'm really excited that we have time for like you said, many questions that are coming through. So thank you so much. It is so helpful. Like I think often, especially in these times, there is kind of a chill and some fear around what nonprofits can do. And so it's really encouraging to hear the whole list and just wealth of options that nonprofits have for things that you can
Yeah.
do.
Well, and I've heard
So
a lot
yeah.
of misinformation in the news about what nonprofits can and cannot do. So this is, well, I won't make a political comment, but yes.
This is all really relevant, right?
Yeah.
There's a chill over everything. Yeah. So it is the times that we are in. So great. Well, let me go ahead and kick us off here with some of these questions. There are some that are pretty similar, and so I've kind of melded them together. So if you don't hear the exact language of your question, it may be incorporated into part of a different question. So this one is there's a couple questions that were about just working as an individual and then as you're representing your nonprofit. There's a question about bumper stickers, or posters. If you're going and doing outreach in a certain community and maybe you have a bumper sticker that, is supportive of a candidate, is that a concern?
Mhm.
And yeah, are there things that you can do as an individual, as a staff member? What things do you need to take into consideration? And I would just add on to that also, like on social media is another place where this tends to come up. So could you
Mhm.
speak to that?
Okay, well, I'll start just generally. So you have to think about a 501c3 as a person. Like, just imagine for a minute that your organization is just actually a person. The restrictions on what you can say as a 501c3 only apply to that entity. As an individual, you don't lose any of your constitutional rights. Um, so, you are free to express yourself as you will outside of work. Social media is a bit trickier. I will touch on that in a minute. So if you're an individual and you're driving to an event and you have a bumper sticker that is political in nature and that, not something your 501c3 would be able to produce, that that's your speech. That's not your organization's speech. Now, if you happen to be in a vehicle that was provided by and owned by the 501c3, then maybe you shouldn't have that bumper sticker on there because that vehicle is property of the 501c3. But your own vehicle, fine. If you are at an event in your individual capacity, it's your speech. Make the speech that you want to make. If you're at an event being run by your organization, you're probably there in your capacity as an employee, and your speech would be attributed to the organization. So we have to err on the side of caution in those events so that, if you made a comment that could be problematic for the organization, it's not going to have an effect on the organization's exempt status. So going up to social media, if you are, for example, say you are a prominent member of your organization, lots of people know that you represent this community foundation or whatever. If you're making political statements on your own um, social media account, it is advisable to make clear that you're making those comments in your personal capacity, just to allay any doubts, so that, if the IRS ever did come in and say, hey, your executive director is making all these political statements, we think they're being made by the organization, you could say, well, no, really they weren't, because I clarified that I am not making these political statements in my capacity as executive director.
That's really helpful. I think many of us that do this work out in the community run into that often because we're doing this work because we care about it and because we're
Mhm.
passionate about it. But it's really important to be pay really close attention to when you're representing the organization and that person, and when we're not. Great, thank you.
Yeah. Well, one more
Um,
thought on this, the social media.
yeah.
Another thing you could do, like if you're not, say, executive director of an organization, don't put your employer on like Facebook or Instagram. Just leave that off because then it fully reduce, like it doesn't fully reduce, but it reduces the risk of any sort of attribution to your employer. LinkedIn is for where you put your employer information.
That's great. Great advice. And that should be a commercial for LinkedIn. We should get a little sponsorship here so that encourage
Yeah,
people
no
to
kidding.
put that on LinkedIn if you're gonna represent your organization. So great, great. There's a couple of questions here around just when does a person become a candidate? And at what point, if there's a current elected official that is running for reelection versus, someone who is not running for office is currently holding that office. Maybe they are term limited or they're just not planning to run. Kind of how do we determine when that person is a candidate versus when they are an elected official and how we interact with them?
Another great question. So the IRS has never defined when a person becomes a political candidate. So it can be a pretty gray area, particularly now where, you've got everybody's who's already in an office is a candidate basically all the time. When we're doing an analysis, we tend to try to find clearer rules. Like we try to look at like, have they made a public declaration that they're running for office or that they're running for reelection? If they filed paperwork with an elections office to be on the ballot, that's usually a pretty clear indication that yes, they are a candidate at that point. But the public statement can also be an indicator. If it's somebody that's very popular and there have been calls for them to run for office, that's where it gets grayer. Like, are they a candidate? Aren't they a candidate? And we're going to look at the full package of like what are we wanting to comment on? Are we wanting to comment on their like an issue that they might have as a potential candidate? Or are we commenting on something else entirely? So again, we have to look at that whole circle of facts and circumstances.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. It is, like you said, there's so many factors, which is again why Stephanie is an attorney, but she is not your attorney in this moment.
Thank you.
Seek your own guidance there. So this next question is around just voter guides, and I think probably this would apply to candidate forums and things like that too. What are the requirements for how many candidates or who should be included? Part of this question says, what if a candidate represents a party with less than 1% of registered voters? I've also seen, ways to measure this around fundraising. Include candidates in your forum that have raised a certain amount of money or the top percentage or something like that. And then what do you say if you invited all the candidates to the forum, but maybe only one has RSVP'd yes? So just candidate forums or surveys, who do you need to include? How do you determine that?
Okay, there's like 20 questions in there, but starting with
I can
um,
repeat if needed.
no. Starting with the voter guides. So again, this is not there's no rules here. I think if you have limited space, time, and resources, what you do is you come up with a nonpartisan way to evaluate who's included. So that's why you've seen, fundraising as a factor, like party support as a factor, like we want to take as many nonpartisan type factors into account when like figuring out like who should we include, or we can just say neutrally we're going to include the top two fundraise like top two of each party in fundraising, and then include all the parties down to independent or the beer brewers of the world party, something like that. um so that is that, and then we were going to now you're gonna have to remind me.
That's okay. Maybe how do you determine what to do if like only one person RSVPs?
Um, yes, and this happens. So it can be a question of you could publish the event and say we invited all the candidates to the forum, only one person responded yes. Or depending on the situation, like that can start looking closer to that line of partisan political activity because there is only one appearance. You could make an effort to get another candidate from the other party. I do think it's helpful that there's some effort made in confirming the RSVPs. Like you've called the candidate's office several times. You've recorded that we called and, either we weren't able to get in touch with the candidate or the candidate specifically said, no, no, I can't make it that day. So there needs to be a little bit more work around a candidate forum when only one person RSVPs. I think there needs to be a pretty robust effort to try to get more than just one candidate there. But my opinion, not legal advice.
Yeah, and it's tricky. Yeah, yeah, depending number of candidates and all of that. There's a lot of factors. So great. So this one delves into a question we get so often. So what is considered a wedge issue, and how do you determine what is a wedge issue? There are so many organizations whose work is dedicated to something
Yeah.
that should be considered nonpartisan, but it has been politicized for whatever reason. Can you speak to just how to kind of navigate that?
I mean, that just kind of depends on the year and what's being argued about. I feel like a good indicator is like what issues are you hearing about the most in the news? Like where is the most clashing? Because there used to be a pretty steady list of wedge issues, I feel like back in the 80s, as I date myself. Um, but the list has gotten in recent years just it's very different from year to year to year. But like if the issue that we think might be a wedge issue is something that your organization advocates for on a regular basis, that's going to reduce the how much we're going to really look at that wedge issue factor because this is what your organization does. Like you're not picking that issue because it's a wedge issue. You're picking that issue because you operate in furtherance of education, educating people about that issue. So just the fact that an issue might be a wedge issue doesn't make an activity automatically political or partisan. It's one of the factors that we look at and it's part of an analysis. I tend to like when I write back to clients, kind of go through each of the factors. I'm like, this is kind of a pro, this is kind of a con. And then we're like, on the balance, I think this is okay, but maybe here are a few things we could do to reduce risk.
Great. Yep. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. Um, uh, so many good questions in here. I'm just sorting through these. There was a question on here that I think you uniquely could speak to. Somebody asked how often nonprofits do get challenged in this way. I know this is something you focused on the last time you did this webinar with
Mhm.
us, and it was really great to hear. But just, yeah, this person asked, has there been a recent instance or what are there some examples? How often does this happen?
Mhm. Yeah. So I don't have the slide in this deck, but you should go look at my last year's slide because I have a slide about the statistics on IRS examination. The bottom line of that is there are three ways that the organization or that IRS identifies organizations for examination. One is based on basically a statistical analysis of Form 990. The other is areas that have been identified by the IRS as like compliance initiatives. For example, Form 990 filing has been one of those initiatives for the past several years. And then the third area, which is actually the biggest area, is referrals and other type of casework. So a lot of organizations get referred to the IRS for investigation. I'm sure you've seen things that have come out of Congressman's office, et cetera. Of the organizations that are referred, I don't have that exact number. It's just very few are examined. when I've done the math, the chance of being examined by the IRS is significantly less than 1%. Like it's in the point zero zero zeros. And even if you are examined by the Internal Revenue Service, the examination is an administrative process and it is a lengthy one. And there's a lot of back and forth with the IRS and the IRS agents, and you have opportunities to provide information, proving your points, to make arguments. So in the end, like the number of organizations that are actually revoked in a given year might be one or two. And one of these, well, or you can be revoked or you can put in an application and the IRS denies your exemption. If the IRS recommends revocation, what happens next is that you go to the IRS Independent Office of Appeals. And appeals is going to look at the application or the revocation, proposed revocation from a different perspective of the IRS. Like, yes, they're looking to see if the IRS got the law right, but they're also looking to see like what are the like risks of litigation here. Is the IRS going to succeed in litigation if the organization goes to court? And so there's just a lot of stuff is settled in appeals, and not much of it gets out of the IRS. And like I said, it's maybe one or two official revocations a year. Political activity tends to be an area where it's a like teeny tiny bit more common, but also where people are more likely to fight. And so we have this Freedom Path case where the court has come back and said the facts and circumstances test is, unconstitutionally vague, and has asked, I think, I forget where we are now, but I think we're waiting on a new briefing in this case to find out what the court may eventually rule.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I'll also, I see Sugalema, our wonderful stage manager for the day, added a link to access our previous webinars there. So you can go back and see that one last year and get those little tidbits as well. Next, here, there have been a couple of questions about either an organization being asked to do something by a party. So one person asked they were asked to hold voter registration tables at weekly meetings held at the library by the Democratic Club in an area that is underrepresented, low propensity voters. And they said yes or no ongoing to that. Can you give any guidance about that? Just partnerships maybe with parties if they ask you? How do you navigate that?
So this is a particularly tricky area because if you provide what I'm going to call in-kind assistance to a political party or to a candidate, that can be considered a political contribution, which violates 501c3. So that's an area I'm not going to get to further detail here, but like you really need to talk to counsel if that's something you're contemplating to figure out a way to do it permissibly because it's an area of high risk.
Yeah, agreed. And this kind of related, and I know I've run into this in my work where you're out and about, you're maybe tabling at a festival and a political candidate comes up during your health fair or your pride festival or whatever it is and takes a picture at your table. And then without you knowing, they are tagging you on social media and talking about, your work and saying, oh, I love this organization I visited. Aren't they great? Associate me with this organization. And so how do you handle, can you get in trouble? Is that something, it would be really hard for you to have any kind of responsibility in that situation, but talk to us about how you might handle that.
I mean, this is a risk management situation. I think like it just like hypothetically, if this were my clients, I would let the client know that, they can acknowledge like, yeah, you're great, but we don't, we're a nonpartisan organization. We don't support political candidates, support or oppose political candidates. So get something out there on the record. But there's a range of reactions here. You can also go to the candidate and say, hey, we didn't authorize this, take it down. And this is where it's helpful to have counsel to talk to about like, what are their options? How can we approach this to make sure it's clear that we're operating within our mission? This was not authorized by us. What approach should we take here, given, whatever other facts and circumstances are motivating your activities?
Yeah. tricky one because you can't, control, when you're doing work
Right.
out in the public. So great. There's another question here about just how to answer questions from community members when they ask you who they should vote for or what party they should support. And you may have really clear opinions personally, but you're out in the community representing your own organization. How do you even start to send people to, we've got two major political parties, but we also have some third parties and more in certain areas. And so, do you have any just maybe language that someone could use if they just get asked, who should I vote for?
I mean, I think you could develop language that's to the extent of, we can't tell you who to vote for. We're a nonpartisan, blah, blah, blah organization, but I can point you to this organization's voter guides or this organization's, voter education materials. Like, I think having the resources to point them to is what is probably the most helpful there.
Great. Love that. Um, would it be just as a follow-up to that, if they said, here's how to get in touch with the, county Republican Party and the county Democratic Party in this area, is that something they could do as long as they offer multiple options?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be a reasonable way to approach it. And that feels more risky to me, like when I put my spidey senses on, but as long
Sure.
as it's, nonpartisan, you're offering multiple options, it could be permissible.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Those are the types of questions we get. Um, great. We are making good time through here. Let me see. Do these rules also apply to board members or volunteers, not just staff members? All of these rules still apply if you're representing the organization?
Yeah, so if you're representing the organization, so yes, it would apply to board members who are acting in their capacity as board members or volunteers who are actively volunteering for the organization. So you need to provide, well, you should provide guidance to your volunteers and board members on the types of things they can say about their political affiliations and feelings, or not say. And it was maybe the case when they're acting in their capacity as directors or volunteers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And is there when going back to some, social media, I have seen folks put in maybe their bio, opinions are my own and not representative of my organization. Is that kind of stuff helpful? Is there any specific language that is better than others?
I mean, that's pretty standard language. It usually covers it.
Great, great. Excellent. Um, And there are a couple of questions on here, also just about 501c4 organizations and kind of the difference. Is there a point at which a 501c3 organization should consider getting a C4 or venturing or exploring that piece? What would cause a C3 organization to want to do that?
So, like, whether a C3 organization should stand up a related C4 is definitely a conversation for council. Um, and it kind of depends on what you want to do with the 501c4. So 501c4 organizations are operated primarily in furtherance of social welfare. It's a different purpose than 501c3. They can engage in unlimited lobbying and they can engage in some amount of political activity. What that amount is not as clear as it used to be, because again, there's another court case out there. Actually, I think it's the same one, Freedom Path, about how much political activity is too much political activity when it's conducted by a 501c4. So like a lot of my organizations they're doing lobbying, they want to do a lot more lobbying. And so then we start thinking about, well, maybe it makes sense to have a 501c4. Or there are activities the organization wants to engage in that are not the best to be engaged in out of a 501c3, but are permissible social welfare activities for a 501c4. So you really need to look at all the facts and circumstances because there's an administrative burden to starting a C4. You have to have a separate corporation, you have to have a separate board of directors, you have to have agreements between the organizations about how you share resources. And it's no small event to stand up an entirely different organization.
It's related to this work with voter engagement, but it's also in the lobbying category as well. Um, great, great. These are all fantastic questions. I want to make sure that we've gotten through uh, the majority of these, which I think we have. So the last question that I'll ask you here that it feels like a good wrap to this is around someone asked, how do we talk about this work without sounding too academic or unapproachable or inaccessible? I know I'm saying that to an attorney who is trained to be very careful with your words, but you know, in how do we take some of this knowledge and transition it into the everyday work, you know, working with everyday people that a lot of these nonprofits and these leaders are doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what I've just presented to you is knowledge for staff to have that informs how they're producing materials that are going to be seen by the public. So, yeah, there are a lot of weird words in this area of law, and I have tried my best to be, you know, conversational about them and not use all the weird terminology that we do, but it can be difficult. But I think that means is you can use your normal everyday plain language to speak with the groups and people that you're trying to help, and keep the more confusing stuff on the backside. So like you know that you can't, you know, endorse a candidate, but you don't need to tell the public that unless they're asking you specifically, like, hey, which do you guys recommend voting for this person? You can say, well, we're a nonpartisan organization. We're not allowed to endorse candidates. Um, Go talk to another organization. Maybe not that, but yeah. And then also, you know, your communication staff is really good at distilling, if you have communication staff, distilling what lawyers say into what other people understand. So they're a good resource to translate, you know, some of the information that you might get from an attorney.
Thank you so much. This is great. Oh my goodness, that is like a rapid fire of questions at you. So thank you so much for walking us through those and sharing your expertise today. Just round of applause here for all of that wisdom you're bringing to us. So the next piece, I as promised, and as we do here, I'm going to leave you with a call to action for everyone. So here is your call to action. I'm going to invite you to go to vote.gov or ballotready.org or ballotpedia.org and find out if there are any primaries happening in your state or in your area. There are some primaries that are happening as early as this month. In some states, there are primaries that have already happened this year. We are in a year of midterm elections, so halfway between presidential elections. And so there are a lot of seats in Congress. There are a lot of Senate seats. There are all kinds of elections that are happening right now and primaries that are happening this spring. So add those dates to your personal calendar, add them to your organizational calendar so that you know what is coming up. Someone shared in the chat. I'll also add here, we love our friends at the League of Women Voters. So Vote 411 is another great resource here as well. I'll include that when we send out the slides. So amplify those primary dates to your community, and also include that November 3rd, Tuesday, November 3rd is the general election this year. So make sure that you have those dates on the calendar so that you can start to prepare, you can start to engage your communities and make a plan to engage those voters. So that is your call to action for the day. The thing I'll ask you to do right after this is fill out our webinar survey. We really do read these surveys and they help us to inform the next webinars and the next programming that we're going to bring to you. So it is 6 short questions. Please fill that out at the end. And then we just want to send you a big thank you. If you're not following us on, LinkedIn, we are on LinkedIn and the other social medias around. So please do follow us, reach out if you have questions, if you need support. We do customized trainings and we've got some toolkits and all kinds of resources there, and we cannot do this work also without your support. So if you feel called to give a gift to Nonprofit Vote as well, there is a link there, and we'll share all of that. All of these resources are provided for free to the community, and so we're happy to do that. And so grateful again to Stephanie for joining us and all of your expertise. Thank you all for wonderful questions. These are great, great questions, and we look forward to seeing you next month. We'll go out tomorrow, but we'll have a webinar on the SAVE Act and a little bit of an update from our webinar last year. So please tune in for that, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.